Corfe Castle today is one of the most notable and famous castles in the whole of England. It sits in a beautiful village and was a royal fortress for centuries, and it played an incredibly important role in the history of the nation. Its huge keep, which towers above the local area, is incredibly dominating and impressive, and during the medieval period, kings and queens would have visited here, staying in great luxury. It's a fortification that has remained close to the monarchy throughout history, with different kings of the Middle Ages adding different structures to add to the defensive element of the castle, as well as to show off the wealth of the royals. One example is King John's Gloriette, which would have been a huge lavish royal extension to the structure during the 13th century. It's certainly an incredible walk around the castle, but also it's mind-blowing when you look at the ruined state. During the English Civil War of the 17th century, the castle was held by a remarkably strong woman, Lady Mary Banks, who withstood 2 sieges by parliamentarians. Lady Banks was seen as a 17th century heroine and a woman of immense strength. However, when the castle eventually fell due to the betrayal from one of her garrison based there, she would be forced to give up the fortification. The only thing Mary was allowed to keep was the keys, and due to its role in the English Civil War and being a symbol of the English crown and resistance against Parliament, it was decided to slight the castle. This must have taken a huge amount of dynamite and explosives to blow up Corfe, and to put it from ever being used in military fashion again. However, what you might not know is that Corfe Castle is not the only castle that sits in the village that shares that name. There is one other castle located nearby that very few people know about. Today we look at the remarkable story of Corfe's forgotten second castle, the Rings. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. From visiting Corfe Castle, you might not be able to spot the forgotten and lost castle, as today very little remains. From the keep, if you look closely in some fields, you will notice a number of different mounds. There's not too much to see, just some low mounds, but they act as a reminder of a civil war that took place during the 12th century in England. During this time, known as the Anarchy, society broke down, and between the years 1135 and 1153 there was a huge widespread breakdown in law and order in England. The conflict revolved really around a succession crisis, and about who was the rightful king or even possibly queen of England. Henry I, who reigned between 1100 and 1135, consolidated power which had been established following the Norman conquest, and he managed to keep the kingdom united, which was rather tricky, especially in the north. Now, to secure the power and prevent further issues and turmoil arising, he named his only legitimate son, William Adelin, as heir to the throne. However, tragedy would strike when William's boat sank in 1120, and the succession plan was thrown into crisis, and Henry desperately needed to find a new heir. He decided that the best idea was that his only other legitimate child, a daughter named Matilda, should take the throne, and at this point she was an empress, married to the German Holy Roman Emperor. Following her husband's death though, she returned to re-enter English politics, and Henry would name her as his heir in 1127. This time, however, is a period where women were deemed not to be monarchs, and there was huge concern about a female running the country. Following Henry's death, England was thrown into a huge succession crisis when Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne and named himself king. This led to huge chaos in the country, with a divide occurring between Stephen's supporters and Matilda's. Stephen was backed by powerful elements of the church and nobility, but he faced constant rebellion. One of these rebels was Baldwin de Redvers, who was the first Earl of Devon. He would be one of the first to rebel against Stephen, and he would never accept the new king. He seized Exeter Castle in 1136, but was eventually driven out of England by Stephen to Anjou, where he joined Empress Matilda. He would return in 1139 with an army of soldiers who supported the Empress in her claim to the throne, and landed at Wareham on the south coast. He tried to capture the town, however was unsuccessful when the royalists drove them out. However, very close by was Corfe Castle. The garrison based here supported the king, however they were sympathetic to Matilda's claim to the throne and her cause, so they let Baldwin and his army in without a fight. Here Baldwin would take control of Corfe Castle, which at the time was still a remarkably impressive sight. Corfe would be too strong to be taken by storm, so a long siege was to begin when King Stephen arrived at the castle with his army ready to retake the fortification. With many medieval sieges, siege towers and weapons would be used to try and break the castle's walls. The rings at Corfe are the remains of King Stephen's siege castle. Stephen would order the construction of a counter castle, which took the form of a ring and bailey fortress. It was made from timber in the way that was common following the Norman invasion. The rings, as it's known, refer to the circular earthwork embankments that the wooden fences or palisades would have stood on, enclosing the siege castle or tower. The rings was just about the right place for Stephen to set up his castle, as it was out of range of arrows that would come from Corfe, and Stephen would construct siege weapons here, such as catapults that could fire upon the rebels. The wooden fences would also help to protect the royalists inside, and the rings or earthwork embankments helped to make this higher. You can see the entrance to the structure, and the whole area is covered by these earthworks, which give it an excellent field of view and sight of Corfe Castle in the distance. The inner bailey is where the small keep would have stood, and is remarkably small, and the outer bailey is where the royalist soldiers would be garrisoned and would have lived. Also in the outer bailey would have been other buildings that could house different professionals, such as blacksmiths who could work on making weapons and armour. A fletcher could also be found here too, someone capable of making arrows and bows. The fear living within this structure though would have been the fact that it was all wooden, which obviously could have easily been burned. Also the wood needed to be maintained in case it went rotten, which was no concern really due to the fact there were forests nearby. The ringed siege castle was found 230 yards west of Corfe, and it's clear that King Stephen and his army would have an excellent view of Corfe. However, they must have constantly thought about how on earth they would take the huge fortification. Corfe Castle would remain too strong to be taken by King Stephen, and the siege that occurred here only lasted a few months. We don't know too much about the action that occurred, or whether the fortification was battered by catapults and other weaponry. It was ended when Matilda herself would land in Sussex in 1139, and Stephen would rush off to confront her, abandoning his wooden castle. The actions at Corfe acted as a great distraction for the Empress to land in England with her 140 knights. Following this, the civil war in England kicked in, and conflict would last for the next 14 years. Baldwin de Redvers, the man who was based in Corfe, was left to his own devices, and was rewarded later for his actions during the siege. Empress Matilda would never manage to gain the throne, but Stephen was forced to accept her son as his heir. Now what happened to the rings, Corfe's lost second castle? Well, they were left abandoned until the 17th century until civil war came around again, this time seeing Charles I pitted against Parliament. The rings were then used as a battery by Parliament artillery and as a structure to bombard Corfe Castle with, as it was held by Lady Mary Banks. So from these earthworks, cannon fire would be launched towards the thick strong walls of Corfe, which shows you what a fantastic place this was to make a siege castle. It would later be known as Cromwell's Battery, showing the importance of this area. So the rings are extremely easy to miss when you visit the beautiful Corfe Castle. However, they have an extremely interesting history that's intertwined with civil war and with succession issues. It's a shame that the only thing that exists today is the earthworks, but naturally wood doesn't survive for centuries. You have to imagine though the fear that the people in the stone castle would have had, seeing this wooden structure quickly made and being constantly fired on by catapults and artillery, with the only thing having to do but withstand it, as you couldn't fire back to attack the rings. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Corfe Castle's lost second castle. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.